Now that we have a pretty good sense of how these keys are labeled, and for now, by the way, I am not counting these black keys, right? They do get labels, of course, but we're not going to worry about them just yet. So let's stick with these naturals, or these white keys, for the time being, and let's go a little bit more in depth. So for example, here's an often confusing question. Find C on the keyboard. Well, as you look around, you remember there are multiple C's on the keyboard. Do you remember how many? The answer is 8, right? Because we went all the way from the bottom or the left and we counted 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, that's middle C. 5, 6. And by the way, just as a quick aside, this is called high C, right? The 6th C on the keyboard as you go left to right. 7, and 8. So there are 8 C's on the keyboard, so you should respond to me when I say find C on the keyboard. You should say which C? Well, unless I specify, for example, middle C or high C, the sixth C on the keyboard, the other ones aren't specified. So how do we do so? Well, if you remember in lesson number 1, we actually counted all the way from the left to the right by counting 1, 2, 3. In other words, the first C to appear, the second cycle C, the third cycle, right? The cycle of 2 black keys and 3 black keys. Here's another one that repeats. So this one is C3. This is the 4th cycle, C4, C5, C6, high C, C7, and C8. So that definitely helps. So right now, if I tell you find C2 on the keyboard, C2, you could say, oh yeah, well this is C1, so that's C2 right there. If I say to you find C5, you could say, well, I remember being in the middle of the keyboard, that's middle C or C4, so the next one up or to the right, that's C5. If I say to you find C8, you should say, oh yeah, that is the last C on the keyboard, C8 is right there. So I think we're pretty confident by this point with finding all of the C's, one of those 8 C's. But what about the other keys? How do we know what number gets associated with them? Well, that's actually pretty straightforward. So let me show you something. This is C1. This is C2. Now, what about the labels of the other letters in between C1 and C2? This is D1, E1, F1, G1, A1, B1, C2, D2, E2, F2, G2, A2, B2, C3. Man, that's a mouthful to say. But do you sense a pattern? In other words, where do these numbers change? Do they change from C through B? Well, no, they stay the same, right? This, for example, is the second cycle. C2, D2, E2, F2, G2, A2, B2. And then this becomes C3. So in other words, these numbers change starting with every new C. So if I point, for example, to a random cycle, let's see, and remember when I say cycle, I mean a cycle of 7 white keys, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, before C comes back, or more simply, more visually simply, a group of 2 black keys, a group of 3 black keys. So if I point to this letter right there, this key, well, you remember that this is G. How do we know? I mean, a number of reasons. We know that this is F because it's the white key to the immediate left of the group of 3. That's an anchor point. And if we just keep going up alphabetically, this is G. So that right there is G. The question is, what number does this get? Well, remember, this is within a cycle that starts on that C. Now, if you remember, this is C5, right? Remember, this is middle C, C4. The next C over to the right is C5. So all of these white keys from C through B, they're all labeled 5. So C5, D5, E5, F5, G5, that's the one we were looking for just a moment ago, A5, B5, and what about this one? That's going to be called C6. Do you remember the other name for this? High C. C6. So let's try a couple of these just for practice, and then we'll go on to the next topic. So what is this one called? Oh, that's easy. We did that one before. This is C8, right? The last C on the keyboard. What about this? Well, we know what letter this is, right? This is letter B. The question is, what number is this? In other words, what cycle is this? This is the 7th cycle. So this is B7. And if you're trying to figure out how do I know this is the 7th cycle, let's go all the way back down to the bottom of the keyboard, the left, and just take a look. Here's cycle number 1, cycle number 2, 3, 4. You notice how it's easier just to point to the groups of black keys? 5, 6, and 7. So this is the last white key, or the last natural key, in the 7th cycle. So this is B7. And of course, C8. Now, if we could just continue extending the keyboard indefinitely, then we would have white keys and black keys within the 8th cycle, and then the 9th cycle, and the 10th cycle. The real question, though, is, I think that's pretty clear, but the interesting question is, what do we do about these 2 white keys, or natural keys, all the way at the bottom? Because after all, this is C1. So what number do these 2 get? Well, what's below 1? 0. So this is A0, and this is B0. And then we start with C1, C2, C3, C4, middle C, C5, C6, high C, C7, and C8. So let's do one more for practice, and then we'll move on to the next lesson. Let's see. What should I call this one right there? So start with what you already know because of our anchor points. That is E. Well, what number does this get? Well, let's see. Well, this one is C4. So that means this cycle is right below it. That's the 3rd cycle. So then, obviously, this becomes E3. And this would be C3, D3, E3, F3, G3, A3, B3, and C4. I think you get it.